Well, my particular interest is in the way people work together in global organizations. So when a company becomes global, you've obviously got some organizational capability things. How do I build that bench strength of people who are able to cope with the complexity of global working? And at an individual level, how do I build my own skills? And so people who are new to working internationally, they may be moving to another country, or they may just be collaborating with colleagues in different locations, different cultures, different time zones. Either way, that's kind of a step up in complexity. And when I first got interested in this, about 25 years ago, I went to visit the oil companies who've been doing this for a long time. And I met a great French HR director, and I asked him, what's the secret of building a global leadership group? He said, it's very simple. Number one, recruit people around the world in proportion to your business. So if 10% of your business is in Nigeria, then 10% of your managers should be Nigerian. So the first thing is about bringing that diversity in. Secondly, he said, mix them up. Because if they only stay in Nigeria, they'll never become global leaders. So you have to put them in expatriation, impatriation, virtual teams, projects, anything at all to get them used to that global context. Okay, so I said, great. What's the third step? He said, well, simply do that for 50 years. And I still think that was the best advice. So bring in the diversity, connect people up, but give it time. It takes a whole leadership generation to build that capability. British leadership styles can clearly work well in an overseas market, but there are one or two things maybe that we come across very often as challenges that are specific to that British cultural style. And whenever you talk about cultures, you're tending to generalize. So we see a whole range of styles depending on the industry and their seniority and those kind of things. But one consistent one is in this area of language. Firstly, we're not very good at languages internationally. We have the benefit of speaking the most used international language in English, but that often means we don't use it very effectively, or we use it too fast, or when we add in things like sarcasm and humour, that's not really the secret to perfect international English communication. And a specific cultural pattern within that is that English leaders tend to be quite indirect. So a good friend of mine who's Dutch, who tend to be much more direct, his first experience working with an English boss, his English boss says, Jan, I suggest you should do this. Now we know that to an English manager, suggest is a direct instruction. He just heard the word suggest. Yeah. So at the end of the year, it came to his appraisal. His English boss said, Jan, where's the appraisal? And he said, I haven't done it. And he said, but I told you to do it. He said, no, it was a suggestion. It was a lousy suggestion. I didn't do it. So we have to learn to be more direct. And very commonly, other cultures miss what we say because we use English as our native language. So we use it in quite a sophisticated way. We're quite indirect, and we use humour. And if you were coming up with a list of guidelines for good international English communication, then sarcasm, saying the opposite of what you really mean, but not showing it on your face, it wouldn't be in the top 10, would it? So I think communication is an area we need to focus on specifically. Well, very often people are asking us, when should we adapt and when not to local cultures? And it's almost as if it's a binary either or. But in fact, what we found is there's 5 choices. So whenever I'm working with someone with a different perspective or a different culture, there's 5 options. The first is do it my way. And very often when people start working internationally, they assume all I need to do is explain it better to my colleagues overseas and they'll understand the wisdom of my way of doing things. So very often people start from that perspective. The second is do it your way. So I adapt entirely. So for example, if I'm visiting Brazil, 300 million Brazilians are not going to change because I turned up. Right. So I'm going to need to be flexible, particularly if they're my customer or if the power's in the relationship. So those, if you like, are the binary choices. There's a third choice, which is do nothing. Okay, I see you're different than I am. Okay. Yes, and very often that's a valid choice to make. It's just different, it's interesting, we don't need to do anything. A fourth choice is to compromise. Can we meet in the middle somewhere? Now, I'm not a fan of compromise because when we compromise, we each give up something to meet in the middle. And often that means we don't really care or it wasn't really important. And then the fifth choice is the win-win. Can we find a new way of working which is relevant both to you and to me? And this is, everybody writes the books about this, the third way, the our way, the win-win. They're actually quite elusive. They're quite hard work. So I would always explore the other choices first. But then there's a long answer to this, which is probably in my book, Making the Matrix Work. But as a methodology, you can think through systematically all 5 choices and really come up with a lot of options. There are some aspects of British leadership style which do help you in an international environment. And when I've interviewed people who work with British leaders, they tend to mention things like pragmatism, fairness, those kind of things. And so that can be helpful. But be careful about engaging a stereotype, because if you act in a way that triggers that stereotype, then you also are associated with all the other things For example, I gave the example of being very indirect. Some people see indirectness as dishonesty, whereas we see it as politeness. So you might engage the whole stereotype, so be a little careful about that. And it can be fun, of course. You know, when I lived in France, if I brought an umbrella, that was funny because I'm an English guy with an umbrella, whereas a French guy with an umbrella, that's not part of the stereotype. So you can have some fun with it, but be careful about reinforcing the stereotype. It's much more valuable to get past that stereotype so that we're engaging as individuals. So you know, when you first start working with people, often they say, well, you're not typically British, which means you don't fulfill my stereotype of the British. And once we get beyond the stereotype, then it becomes about you and me, and that's a much more healthy place to be.